Hello, good afternoon and welcome to this very special webinar. Not only it is the final session of our conference, but it's also the launch of our new campaign. My name is Hannah Stolton and I'll be hosting this session. I am white British, female with short brown hair and glasses. So our new campaign, All Pupils, Every Ambition. But before I introduce our session and our expert panel, I would just like to briefly run through some points of administration. Closed captions are available. You just need to switch them on at the bottom of your screen if you need them. Speakers have been invited to share a short verbal description of themselves, as I've just done. The chat function is disabled for this session, but you can post questions into the panel, into the Q&A panel, and I'll then put them to the speakers. If you're disconnected, please just rejoin the session using the link that you had. The session is being recorded and links to the video will be sent out probably early next week now, but we'll also send links to the slides, resources and the contact details of our guest speakers. Please do continue to follow this campaign and like and share the content on social media. We're using the hashtag #AllPupilsEveryAmbition, the name of the campaign. And finally, at the end of the session, we will be sharing a short post-session survey and we'd be really grateful if you could provide any feedback there. Thank you. So, all pupils, every ambition. We see so many people motivated to become governors, to help pupils leave school equipped to make the most of the rest of their life, be it through academic, social or personal development. We all benefit when every pupil has the support, guidance and opportunity to make the most of their talent, personality and drive. Unfortunately though, as the pandemic has exposed, many pupils are falling short of who and what they could be, often due to factors beyond their control. Whilst education is only part of a wider picture, we believe schools can be a tremendous engine to help drive the success of all pupils, regardless of background and circumstance, to help pupils to dream bigger, achieve more at school and beyond. Our campaign will be exploring how governors can support schools to address the challenges involved in raising levels of attainment and preparedness for later life, what obstacles and opportunities exist, and what the future could be for all pupils. We want to inspire and equip current and potential governors to help schools in their efforts to enable all pupils to realise their ambitions. To that end, this term our focus is on better than normal. We'll look at the questions governors should be asking around attainment gaps in the classroom, as well as the impact of COVID-19 on learning. We'll look at the innovations and the interventions you might expect to see your school implementing to address these issues. We are delighted that Governor Hub has agreed to support us with the first term of our campaign, both financially and through access to the expertise of the key group. So now I'll hand over to Neil Collins, founder and director of Governor Hub.
That's great, thanks Hannah. My name is Neil Collins, I'm a managing director at Governor Hub and director here at the key group. I'm white British. Most people probably describe me as middle-aged, slightly greying hair, not that good all in all. We're so pleased to support this campaign during this term, particularly, I mean, myself as a governor, been a governor for over 20 years, and the thing that comes up at almost every meeting is the gaps that some people struggle to get across, the gaps that we see between different pupil groups. And it's something that we've all worked so hard on as governors, but it's been almost blown apart by the pandemic, and all those gaps have increased even more. And we think that particularly with things like this campaign, we can really focus governance and governors on reducing that gap and bringing back a system which is even better than it was before, and making sure that we bring pupils through that. So thanks again, Hannah, for letting us be part of this, and let's hope the launch event goes really well.
Thanks ever so much, Neil. Thank you. So to begin exploring this vast but obviously crucial topic, we're delighted to be joined today by three fantastic guest speakers. They're going to share their experience and perspectives on recalibrating the classroom. We have Joe McGinn. Joe is the head of school partnerships at ImpactEd. ImpactEd is a not-for-profit organisation that helps schools and education providers improve pupil outcomes and life chances by working together to understand and improve the impact of the programmes that they run. Joe has 10 years of experience in youth work, third sector programme delivery and an educational project management. He is passionate about improving social mobility. Dr. Chris Wood is our second speaker. He's the Head of Research, Publications and Enrichment at Regent Group in London, prior to which he was an independent research consultant working with private, public and third sector organisations. Chris is a former advisor to the Chief Inspector for Education and Principal Officer for Research Publications. Chris drafted ministerial advice notes, authored influential survey reports, contributed to parliamentary inquiries, and has been a keynote speaker at national and international conferences. Finally, we have Dr. Tony Breslin. Tony is a public policy analyst and writer specialising in education, participation and the third sector. A teacher by profession, he has taught and held management and leadership responsibilities in various school settings, as well as various other governance roles across a range of education-focused organisations. Currently serving as Director of Breslin Public Policy and Breslin Social Impact, his latest book, Lessons from Lockdown, The Educational Legacy of COVID-19, has been critically acclaimed and is on my bookshelf. So our thanks to them all for being with us today. I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Joe McGinn.
Thank you, Hannah. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Yeah, pleasure to be here. My name is Joe, Head of School Partnerships at ImpactEd. I'm 31 years old, I guess white Irish heritage with short brown hair and a sort of gingerish beard, I suppose you could call it. And just behind me, there's a quite nice bunch of yellow flowers as well, if that helps kind of set the scene of the screen. So I am going to talk you through some key findings from a piece of research that we at ImpactEd ran sort of in 2020, and it was published earlier this year around February. And it basically looked into the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic and school closures were having on the learning and well-being of different demographics of pupils across England. I guess a little bit about the work that we do before diving into this research. So we have, as Hannah said, we're a non-profit and we partner directly with individual schools, multi-academy trusts, local authorities, charities, anybody who is working with young people or in education, and we try to help them better understand, evaluate and improve the impact of a wide variety of pieces of work that they do. So that could range from an individual school coming to us and saying, we are spending 50, 60 grand on a pupil premium intervention and we have no idea if it's having the impact on the pupils who are trying to target, right the way up to a whole multi-academy trust trying to understand what the value add is of bringing 10, 15 new schools into their trust. So that's kind of a little bit about the work that we do. If I can flick across to the next slide, and then I'll just go into the background and context behind this particular piece of work. First of all, worth saying that we're not typically a kind of large national research body. We do sort of research and evaluation with individual schools and educational organisations, like I mentioned. But when the first lockdown hit and schools had to shift very quickly to remote learning, we found ourselves in a really unique position where we had a couple of hundred school partners across the country. We had the ability to get questionnaires out to pupils all across England, and we had schools who trusted us and knew how to work and navigate our platform. So we realized we were in quite a privileged position to help conduct some research and to try and help the sector learn from this particularly challenging and interesting period in education. And it's probably fair to say that the shift to remote learning and pupils having to stay at home on the whole is probably the greatest natural experiment in our education system since maybe the evacuees left in the Second World War. It's really quite a large shift. And whilst that's challenging, it provides really interesting opportunities to learn and conduct research. So we basically spoke to all of our school partners and we invited some new schools to participate in this piece of research. And primarily it was looking at getting pupils to complete a series of questionnaires on a sort of 3 to 4 week cadence from the first lockdown around kind of March or April, right the way through till November of last year. And the whole point was to try and help individual schools understand what was happening with their pupils, but also at the same time to help the sector try and understand what trends might be happening at a national level. We partnered with, as you might be able to see on the slides, the universities of York and the universities of Bristol, who are our academic partners on this piece of research. And some things about this piece of research that we think makes it quite unique. So it was all pupil level data. It was pupils completing questionnaires about themselves. There are pros and cons of every type of research method and every way of gathering data, but that's the method that we used for this particular piece of research. It was longitudinal, as I mentioned. It ran for about 9 months, including over the summer. It had a sort of a rich range of data, including pupil surveys, and we also linked assessment and attainment data. And because we could pull in data from school MIS systems, we were also able to break down for whether students were pupil premium or had English as an additional language or special educational needs. And yeah, the real key part of this is that individual schools were able to view their own results in their own context. So if we can flick to the next slide after that one, a few final pointers. As far as we know, unless there's somebody else who's done a similar piece of research and is just keeping very, very quiet about it, as far as we know, this is the largest people-facing piece of research of its kind into the impact of lockdown. And the key skills that it focused on were pupil well-being, anxiety, their grit, their learning resilience, their metacognitive ability, and then a particular index that we sort of put together ourselves based on what other organizations and charities in the sector were doing around people's sort of attitudes to learning during the new COVID environment. So we just flick to the next slide. We had, over 60,000 pupils taking part in the research project as a whole. As you can see, broken down, we had nearly 100,000 responses to our wellbeing questionnaire, which is the WEMWeb survey, and then around 80,000 for metacognition, all the way going down to anxiety, around 68,000, grit 20,000. So it was a real rich range of data, and quite a large sample that we're quite proud of and quite pleased about. And we just flick to the next slide, Chris Whitty style. So that's the sort of methodology and kind of the background behind the research. So the executive summary, the report itself is available to view on our website at impacted.org.uk. But some of the key findings that we found out, first of all, there was this probably won't surprise anybody in this call, but there was a clear correlation between pupil wellbeing and pupil learning, and those pupils who suffered the kind of greatest impact on their well-being in a negative way were also the ones who appeared to have the lowest learning scores as well. So with that with that in mind, when I reference and refer to anything to do with pupil well-being, just take it as a given that is correlated with pupil learning scores at the same time. But what we found is during the first lockdown, pupil well-being remained fairly stable, and this certainly surprised us. I don't know if it seems like a long time ago, but I don't know if people can think back to that first lockdown. The weather was quite nice. There was a bit of camaraderie. There was a bit of excitement. There was clap for carers, clap for the NHS, and those things, and maybe the excitement. It didn't appear to affect pupils' well-being and their learning during that first period. But obviously there were particular kind of gaps and differences when you kind of dive into the data. And during 2020 in particular, those challenges with remote learning were felt much more strongly, as you'd imagine, by pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. And what our research found, which was really interesting, is that with the shift to remote learning, there were new forms of disadvantage that became apparent that we all realized schools did a very good job of preventing. So it wasn't so much whether a pupil had access to advice, because from what we saw, schools and local authorities and trusts did a truly excellent job at trying to get devices out to as many pupils as possible. But if you have to share that device with 4 other siblings, or if you don't have a quiet place to work, or if you don't have a desk to work on, or if you are the eldest sibling in a family where your parents might not speak very good English, you have to spend more time helping your younger sibling with their work as opposed to doing your own work. So there were loads of different interesting forms of disadvantage that we found were quite novel. And so those traditional markers of, I guess, family income weren't enough to get a good picture of the disadvantage that was happening. And that was a really interesting finding from the research. And then lastly, sort of linked to that, is that the schools we worked with found there was a real risk of lost children. So pupils that initially wouldn't have been flagged up on a kind of safeguarding framework or matrix as being particularly vulnerable, but because there are these new forms of disadvantage and a new environment that was taking place, those sort of disadvantages that were quite unique became a bit more prominent. So if we can just flick to the next slide, please. I'll just dive into these 3 findings in a little bit of detail very quickly. So this is the one around pupil wellbeing and learning during that first lockdown. So as you can see, it remained fairly stable up until July. It dipped a little bit in the summer, but then the return to school in September, and bear in mind this is in 2020, didn't appear to, there was no sort of obvious bounce as pupils returned to school last academic year. If you can remember, you know, school was quite different. Pupils were in bubbles, there were bubbles collapsing, they couldn't see their friends in the playground. So yeah, that was definitely coming out in some of the data that we saw. And if we flick to the next slide. Yeah, as I mentioned, disadvantaged pupils were, you know, much more negatively affected. If you can see this graph here, the small dot is where pupils were at in July, and the large dot is where they were at in November. And whilst sort of some demographics were relatively similar, if you can see the middle one, pupils with SEN and those without SEN were broadly similar. There was quite a pronounced gender gap, and female pupils appeared to be struggling more with their well-being and their anxiety and their learning compared to male pupils. And then there was a noticeable gap for disadvantaged pupils as well. If you see that second one there, where it shows pupil premium eligibility. Really interestingly, if you look, pupils who were marked as EAL were the only group in our data that showed an increase in their well-being between July and November. There's a few, our report doesn't necessarily suggest why. We leave that up to teachers because, you know, the drivers of these things will be different in different contexts. But some anecdotal reasons we're hearing are that when pupils initially were at home, pupils who were struggling with English in their own school were more comfortable using their native mother tongue when they were at home. But then as that lockdown sort of progressed, the fact that their parents were less able to help them with their homework and their work at home sort of appeared to affect their well-being. And then when they returned to school in November, they were sort of the only core group who appeared to increase and appeared to see a bounce. Again, that's kind of anecdotal, and it'll be different reasons and different drivers in different contexts, but those are some of the kind of things that some of our teachers are mentioning. If we just flick to the next slide. And just to reinforce this point, on all the measures we used, metacognition, well-being, anxiety, our COVID Learning Index, that disadvantage gap was reflected quite clearly for basically every region that we worked with in this piece of research. And we'll flick to the next slide there. If you can see this bar graph, this just reinforces the point that although there were some clear national trends, there are little micro trends inside there that are sort of worth exploring. So this bar graph here represents, every bar is every school who took part in this piece of research. And the green bars are the primary schools, and the grey bars are the secondary schools. And if you, it might be sort of small font, but this is basically this shows the percentage of pupils in those schools who indicated they were excited about being back at school in September. And very clearly we can see that the greens, the primary schools, were far more excited about returning to school than the secondaries. But if you look really closely, we've got one secondary school where over 80% of pupils indicated that they were excited about being back at school, right down to the very bottom on the far right, we've got a secondary school where fewer than 20% of the pupils were excited about being back at school. So there are clear national trends, but that shouldn't disguise the fact that there are obviously, you know, variations within that, and it's always worth exploring what's happening in a particular context. And sort of final few slides, just sort of spelling out that point even more. I mentioned there was a pronounced gender gap from our findings, but that again shouldn't disguise the fact that there are pupils who can sometimes slip the net. So here, this graph clearly shows that female pupils on the whole had lower well-being and learning scores than their male counterparts, but there's still you know, a notable number of male pupils who were struggling during lockdown as well. So there are clear national trends, but there's great variation and great significant variation for each of these trends at the same time. So as part of that report, we didn't just want to sort of throw the data out there and you know, some of it is a bit doomy and gloomy, but we wanted to provide some recommendations for schools to consider as well as they you know, start bouncing back and you know, getting used to the new normal. So on the report, we had 3 recommendations, one linked to each finding. Around kind of well-being and learning strategies should focus on individual pupil experiences as well as the challenges. And it's worth noting, we ran some case studies and there were plenty of pupils who found that the experience of learning at home allowed them to come a lot closer to their family and see you know sort of people in their neighborhood that they haven't seen for a while. So sort of having a blanket approach to kind of pupil well-being or learning doesn't appear to be the answer, and it's worth kind of diving into those particular contexts and environmental challenges that each kind of pupil group faces. The kind of second recommendation is that you know, post-lockdown support should be really carefully evaluated to make sure that those disadvantaged pupils who appear to be struggling the most are getting the interventions and the provision that they need. And then finally, and this was the one that I think probably hit home with us ImpactEd the most, that risk of children who typically weren't flagged as being vulnerable or at risk slipping through the net. So just our key recommendation is for schools to try and make sure that they find ways of gathering data directly from pupils themselves around their experience of their school life and their home life as well. And this is something that schools are typically already very good at, but it's certainly something that was reinforced by the research that we ran. So that was it for, well, it was a kind of 60-page report that I've managed to get it cut down to sort of 10 minutes or so, I hope. But then what we're doing next, if you go to the final slide, is we are running a similar piece of national research over the course of this year. Each term we will publish a state of the nation snapshot of pupil wellbeing across the country, and then associated with each of those reports will be a particular theme that links to pupil wellbeing. So this term we'll be looking in detail at how disadvantaged provision, how good practice for disadvantaged pupils can really impact on wellbeing. In spring term, we'll be looking at reading provision, and then in the summer term, we'll be looking at staff wellbeing and how that impacts on pupil wellbeing as well. And in particular, we don't just mean teaching staff, we mean non-teaching staff as well, support staff, site staff, a lot of people who typically don't get a voice in this sort of research. We want to really try and capture, because no doubt they have an impact on school culture and wellbeing and learning of young people as well. So I think that was my final slide. So yeah, I hope some of those findings that were interesting. It might not necessarily be news to anybody who's on this call, and if you'd like to find out a little bit more, then yeah, feel free to contact me on the details that you can see on the screen there.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was really fascinating. Lots of things to take away there, and yes, I'm sure we'll come back to them with questions at the end. I will now hand over to Dr. Chris Wood, though, to share his slides.
Thank you. Excellent. Right. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Chris Wood. I'm Head of Research, Publications and Enrichment at Regent College. My talk this afternoon is on recalibrating assessment post-COVID-19. It will focus particularly on GCSE and A-level, but in a sense, those areas are equally important for those of you who are working in primary sector education, as it's a kind of a journey point for the children you're working with in the not too distant future as well. I'm 50, I'm white British, I wear glasses, I've got a beard, I suppose salt and pepper colour. I was impressed with Joe's description, giving some sort of colour to it, and I've got short brown hair. Could we go on to the next slide, please? Yeah, just a little bit about me in terms of the background. I was previously one of Her Majesty's inspectors, so I worked a lot with primary schools, secondary schools, and teacher education providers. And as part of that role, one of the many things that I really enjoyed doing was having opportunities to talk to members of the governing body about the importance of the work they did. And one of the discussions that we often had is that excellent governors ask excellent questions because they're well informed both about the bigger picture and the minutiae. And really my conversation, my talk this afternoon is really a think piece, really. It's about that bigger picture thinking around assessment, that hopefully it will be interesting and useful for people in the audience, just to sort of think beyond the confines of the day-to-day structures of assessment. In a past life as well, I was a local authority school improvement advisor. My speciality was English. I also worked in the basic skills sector, and at heart I'm a teacher. I was an English teacher and a senior leader in schools. Could we go on to the next slide, please? So in December we published a report. It wasn't an original research piece. It was a review of the literature that was out there. It was a review of what we knew about what was happening in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on exams, both in the UK and globally. And what we hope to do by producing that report, that sort of overview, that review of where we were, was to identify some lessons learned for the future. And in particular, one of the things we were looking at, which I won't necessarily talk about this afternoon, was looking at some of the implications for higher education in terms of admissions for students. And I think you're going to get copies of these slides. So I've got a link to the report in the slides. Could you go on to the next slide, please? So I'm going to start with the recommendations, because we produced this report a while ago, and actually I've revisited these recommendations on a number of occasions, and I still think they're really pertinent. We shared these with key policymakers, we shared them with the DfE, we shared them directly with the recently departed Secretary of State, and the one recommendation that I think to me still stands out as really important is that we give consideration to reintroducing modular examinations and externally moderated teacher assessments to safeguard GCSEs and A-levels and examinations going forward. This report was published in 2020. It was very much looking at what the impact had been on that sort of first round of examinations during COVID. But I think, as we've seen, the impact has continued, and I think the tail of the impact will continue for some time. And we also made a recommendation around consulting with the sector on how we could improve admissions processes for higher education to better meet the needs of students in universities and employers in this kind of digital age that we were moving into. And I know some of that has happened and is happening, and it's very much a hot topic at the moment about how do we manage the student intake into higher education. And then the other two recommendations that we made, in a sense, were the kind of more aspirational, wider, bigger thinking ones, around really looking at how alternative and technology-enabled assessment systems could support assessment in education to help us mitigate some of the issues presented by COVID, and in particular digital alternatives to the traditional pen and paper testing and marking. So those were the recommendations that I still think very much resonate now, and I think it's very much a time where we in the world of education need to be having some very robust, energetic discussions about what we want assessment to look like in the future, and whether we want to kind of just return to the status quo, the pre-COVID-19 status quo. Could we go into the next slide, please? So, I mean, one of the things that I think is really important is it's, you know, if we're living and working in the UK and we're receiving lots of the media around the UK, it can very much feel as though we're the ones getting it all wrong. But actually, the impact of COVID on exams, on assessments, was a global issue. It affected countries worldwide. And as they had to adjust very rapidly to this unprecedented world event. And yes, it was most pressing for those students who were at the end of a particular phase of their education and required some form of stamp, some form of approval to move on to the next stage. But it had that widespread impact across the world. If you could go on to the next slide, please. So what we actually found, and this was sourced from various places, but Ofqual produced a very good summary of this at the time, is different countries responded in different ways. I mean, in France, the baccalaureate was cancelled for the only time since it was introduced in 1808, and results based on average marks and homework marks for the students. In Italy, there were changes to the balance of assessments. They continued actually with their oral examinations, but they changed the balance of teacher assessment to assessment marks. In the Netherlands, results were based on in-school exams, which will usually account for 50% anyway. Norway, exams were cancelled, but actually in Norway, 80% of final marks are teacher assessed anyway. So actually the impact was far less. Next slide, please. In Spain, exams were delayed, and the content that was assessed was adapted to account for any loss in learning. In the Caribbean, exams were postponed and new tests were designed, multiple choice tests were designed. In China, the university entry exam, which is one of the oldest exams alongside A-levels, was put back and was put back to July. In Germany, after some sort of toing and froing, I think the exams actually went ahead, but with social distancing. Similar arrangements in Hong Kong, and in USA, new exams were written that could be taken across a range of digital devices. So the responses were quite different, and the responses were very much made in terms of national priorities, but particularly in terms of the ways in which those education systems organize their assessment. And I suppose the one conclusion from that was that the countries that were least reliant on standalone set-piece terminal examinations found it easier to mitigate some of the issues that perhaps we found in the UK. Next slide, please. I'm going to whiz through the next few slides. There's quite a few slides here that I hope will be useful, when you're able to access them. But I'll whiz through them because a lot of this is very recent history. A lot of this will be things that you're very familiar with. I think there's probably not that many people that wouldn't agree that there was a bit of a car crash in that first year, with changes in decisions about how best to assess young people in terms of their GCSEs or in terms of their A-levels. Models were created, models were found to be wanting, and then we moved to a form of teacher assessment, unmoderated teacher assessment, that really left everybody feeling as if, well, actually, we've found our way through it, but it wasn't the best way we could have done this. But we've made the best in the circumstances that we can. Next slide, please. So, for me, the thing that COVID has done, and this would be something that others agree with, others disagree with, has exposed weaknesses in terminal exams. Particularly in terms of the A-level, which has very much been seen as the gold standard of examinations, and it's actually strengthened the case for bringing back a more balanced system of teacher assessed, moderated coursework into the system. And there's some questions there that I raised, and again, we know what the answer to this is. when we were producing this report, we really felt that surely the same problems that we'd experienced in 2020 wouldn't be experienced in 2021, that better assessment systems would be put in place. And whilst, you know, I think it can be argued that the results were far less chaotic and upsetting for individuals, that actually we made some of the same errors that we'd made in 2020. Next slide, please. So, I mean, one of the things is when you're having your conversations about assessment, these bigger conversations about assessment, there is absolutely, you know, high-profile critics of the current system. You know, whether it's the chair of the Education Select Committee, or whether it's the assessment reform group that I'm going to talk about very quickly in a minute. But I think this, you know, this from Rob Halfon from 2019, so pre-COVID-19, you know, is very telling. You know, GCSEs have had their day. We should be looking for a more holistic way of assessing students, something that looks both at the academic, the technical, and the personal skills. Next slide, please. And, you know, other big figures such as Lord Baker has argued that the curriculum and the way that the curriculum is assessed doesn't really meet the needs of students today. And interestingly, PISA, the branch of the OECD that looks at these things, has really started to move away from looking at narrow forms of assessment in its analysis of students. Next slide, please. Just going to start to wrap up. Coursework and tech are not a panacea, but I mean, one of the things that we can see is if we had teacher-assessed grades, a more balanced view of teacher-assessed grades across the lifespan of the student, not all condensed at the kind of single points at the end of a student's, at a pupil's career, that would help. And that the technology already exists that can assist teachers, educationalists, to speed up the process of assessing students across a real wide range of factors. Next slide, please. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just hurrying up here. I'd invite people to go and look at the Rethinking Assessment group. I've got the link in the slides here. And really, one of the questions they ask is not, are examinations themselves bad, but do examinations examine the right thing? And they've got some excellent resources, blogs, articles on different assessments, global assessment approaches, looking at wider capabilities, dispositions, ways of assessing character, resilience, social learning. And final slide, please. If you just go on to the final slide. I've redone this. This is from Bill Lucas. I've adapted this purely because he's really great diagram. The image of it is tiny, and I looked for a bigger image of it and I couldn't find it. But I think this is a really helpful thing for teachers, but also for governing bodies when they're thinking about what is assessment for, how do we organize our assessment, and whether we have examinations or not, how do we best move assessment into a sort of better place for our students. Next slide, please. I am going to wrap up. I do apologize. Yeah, just onto the last slide, the very last slide, please, of the presentation. Yeah, perfect. I am a positive person. I'm a glass half full person. And, you know, the glass half empty response would be is that we're just going to return to the status quo, and we're going to try and reinstate all of the old school, terminal, standalone, high stakes examinations. I think it would be really good if we as educationalists can really be vocal and advocate for a change that helps us to build on some of the benefits and some of the improved ways of assessing students that we've discovered during the COVID-19 pandemic. I apologize that that's a whiz through. My timer says that's 16 minutes. I did have 15 minutes, but I've gone over a little bit. So thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, Chris. A lot to take away there. We will definitely share the slides so that everyone can see them. I would just say, if you've got any questions, please put them into the Q&A. We will endeavour to get to them at the end if we can. And we're now going to hand over to Dr. Tony Breslin.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with you this afternoon. I'm somewhat in awe of the first two presentations and probably haven't been focusing sufficiently on thinking through what I'm going to say to you. But if we roll on through the to the first slide, and indeed to the second one, because that's the subliminal advertising slide. So that's been there long enough, and now we can start. But just I've spent, you know, like so many people, I work independently now. I'm a teacher by background. I'm still at my happiest in the classroom. I'm a chair of governors. I was at one stage a chief examiner at GCSE and a principal examiner at A-level. I was really reassured that someone of Chris's background and expertise was saying the things that he was. You know, I think it's worth thinking about this whole thing, about what we want to happen after lockdown. I've, like so many other people, 18 months ago, I had a kind of, I won't say I had a full order book, but I had plenty planned for the months ahead, and it all stopped. And coincidentally, a few months previously, I'd finally thought, I really need to, you know, I've got a book in me, I need to write. Well, actually, I could do nothing else once lockdown started. I had nothing else to do. So, and in discussions with a publisher, and I said, look, we've just got to capture this. The output, first output was lessons from lockdown. The second output from the project is a book called Bubble Schools and the Long Road from Lockdown, which I hand over the manuscript for in about a month's time. The third, Reschooling Society After COVID, will give you an idea of where my thinking's going. But unlike the terrific quantitative data that Joe's used, and by the way, I forgot to say, I'm grey, I wear glasses, and I'm not as tall as I'd like to be, and I'm of Irish heritage. I should have said that at the beginning, shouldn't I? Sorry. Anyway, Joe presented this fantastic quantitative data, and I was actually very encouraged by that. I was encouraged by Chris's question about where we go from here. My work has been based almost entirely in terms of primary research on focus groups and face-to-face interviews with pupils, parents, and education professionals. And we've finished all of the focus groups across both books, all of the focus groups and all of the interviews. We finished them by asking one kind of double question. And any researcher will tell you, you're not really meant to ask double questions. But the question we finished with is this: take yourself back to February 2020, just before, you know, the juggernaut of COVID-19 swung into view, and ask yourself, what can't you wait to get back to? And what can't you wait to leave behind? And I think it's absolutely critical that we think of the second one as much as the first. That we think of what we want to leave behind and what this may offer us an opportunity to leave behind, or at least gradually, progressively move on from. So the research sought to capture the experience of lockdown in the moment. It seeks to give voice to the groups I've already identified. I'm trying to think, you know, can we make schooling better than it was? Because it seems to me, with all the calls to get back to normal, what we overlook is that, for my money, most of the issues that COVID exposed pre-existed COVID. As Joe's shown, they've often been deepened or worsened. They've certainly been made more visible. But the main reason we shouldn't go back to where we were is perhaps was not as successful as we convince ourselves that it was. So each book, each chapter concludes with a set of recommendations, And the hope is that they'll, sorry, if you can move to the next slide, I just pressed a button on my machine. And so here are some headlines. Right, first, I think what it's really shown us and reminded us, and again, this is not, this is not new stuff, but it is stuff that sometimes we forgot. One, schools have multiple functions, educational, of course, but also socioeconomic, as agents of socialisation, as community hubs, as providers of respite from full-time parenting, because a lot of us have done a lot more of that of late. For the most part, as I say, COVID has not caused the gaps in attainment, the poverty, the differential experiences that it has exposed. 40 years ago, Basil Bernstein wrote that famous article, about whether education can compensate for disadvantage. They wouldn't listen. They didn't listen to Basil Bernstein. They have listened to Marcus Rashford. So some of the visibilities that have come through, I think we can do something with. Third one, and I was pleased with the nature of Joe's conclusion, reassured, relieved with the nature of Joe's conclusions here. Every child, every family, every school, and even every year group has had a different lockdown. And across the past year, in the past 18 months now, of course, most children, parents and teachers have had periods as lockdown strugglers, lockdown survivors and lockdown thrivers. And I originally thought they were three separate groups. I was kind of trying to get this schema in terms of explaining what was happening. And then it dawned on me, actually, these aren't three separate groups. They're three states that we've all passed through, and some of us have spent more in one position than another. But we actually need to identify not just the struggling of lockdown, the thriving, the new thinking, the resilience that's been developed and so on. If we could go to the next slide, please. The challenge now facing schools is much more than about catch up. I'm not going to say relaxed because that gives a sense of complacency, but I have an immense faith in the profession that we can, certainly for those young people who still have a fair bit of time in school, we can address the stuff that they will have missed. And we mustn't forget that, quite a number of them have done quite a lot of work at home and away from school and in different ways. So we can do the catch up. It may be expensive, it may be quite challenging, but we can do it. If we know somebody hasn't done fractions in maths, we can do fractions in maths. But I have no idea how a 6-year-old catches up on a year's worth of play dates. I have no idea how a 14-year-old catches up on a year not jostling in the corridor and on the staircase in the way that sometimes drove me mad as a teacher. But actually, and I so much enjoyed as a pupil, actually it's part of becoming social and becoming an adult. I do think a positive arising from this is that relationships with those families previously labelled hard to reach have typically, not universally, there are no universals in this, have often strengthened during the pandemic. In fact, first lockdown, we really struggled to reach those families. Second lockdown, I think in some senses, we were often surprised at our success. One of the interesting things that I've picked up in a lot of the focus groups was that those so-called vulnerable children, and if you want parents to keep vulnerable children at home, the one way of doing it, of course, is to publicly label them as vulnerable, because then you don't want to send your child in and go along with that definition. But second lockdown, softer definition, few more in school. But what we did find was a lot of those children actually got anxious when they knew schools were reopening again, because actually they were going to have crowded classrooms back, and they had made great progress during the quieter period. Okay, and we must harness, next slide please, the creativity of this period. And then we set out some recommendations. I think I've got about 90 seconds, right? But we need to concentrate on social and not just curricular recovery. We need to draw on the positives of the lockdown experience. We need to be much more nuanced in our understanding in the whole assessment piece. I don't have this here, but I must say it. It seems to me that we need to think of the last 2 years as grading spikes, not grade inflation. They're spikes caused by very particular circumstances, and the moral panic of grade inflation doesn't help us at all. Next slide, please. And some national recommendations, really about rethinking attainment and inclusion. Attainment flows from inclusion, that if we focus just on pushing kids to catch up all the time, we'll actually exclude some of our children who might find that more difficult. We need to get serious longitudinal research going on this, because we won't know the impact of this for 10 years. And we need to track these young people, teachers, educationalists, families that have been through this. I won't go through reading the list of those. I think it's final slide next. Yeah, actually there were two, but there's just some questions here. I'm not going to read them through to you. Perhaps we can pick them up, Matt, in the Q&A, and in the Q&A, and a second slide of questions, I think, as well. If we can move on to that, that's great. And of course, as governors, what role can we play? How can we support our school leaders, our teachers, our school communities? And how can we have the courage to do something a bit different? Because out of this, we need to, there's been some fantastic stuff during this period. We need to decide on what Tracy Middleton, a governance clerk in Hertfordshire, calls COVID keeps. She's not sure if she originated the phrase, but I said I'd acknowledge her whenever I use it. And there's the question, what are we going to keep from this? Or are we not going to learn the lessons of lockdown? And are we just going to dash back to a system that didn't have it all right in the beginning? Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you ever so much, Tony. Lots to take away there, and leading us very nicely onto questions, that's for sure. So my first question to the panel is, given where we are with the pandemic and the school year, beginning of the school year in September, what would be your priorities for governors and schools, but mainly governors, that's mainly our audience, looking to improve attainment and address the gaps in learning? So where would your priorities lie? I'll come to you, Tony, first, because I know that you whizzed through those Q&A, and I'm sure there was probably a couple there that answered.
I was hoping I'd pass those on to others. Anyway,
oh, sorry.
I would say this. I think we need to think really clearly about well-being and reintroducing young people to school. And I think one of the things that we might see out of this is some of the young people, able but often quite compliant young people, particularly in upper secondary, who've never given schools a moment's trouble. Some of those young people are now saying, do we really need to run to a different room every 45 minutes? Do we really need to do it? Gee, I can get a lot of this on Google. Right? Now, I'm not suggesting, by the way, we replace Year 10 with Google. I might have done that when I was teaching them a few years back. But what I am saying is, actually, we shouldn't be complacent about, I think there's a kind of thought that we'll get back to normal and the children that always presented difficulties will continue to, and the ones that never did won't. I've got a feeling this mixes it up really substantially. So I think we need to talk about well-being. I think we need to talk about diagnosing where young people are, which I think is a more nuanced thing than simply assessing. And I think then we need to really talk about what do we need to put in place to make them successful as learners, so that they can make the speed on catch up, rather than they are pushed relentlessly through extra worksheets, probably through a non-qualified teacher acting as a tutor. I've probably been unfair on some tutors there.
Thanks, Tony. Joe, obviously your data showed wellbeing as a key consideration. Was there anything that you wanted to add on what governors should be focusing on?
I completely echo what Tony just said. That diagnosis of pupil well-being is so key, and there's been lots of research in the past, and our research has just shown that correlation now is as strong as it's ever been. Just a few sort of, I guess, anecdotal things that we've heard from some of our schools is just, and I think schools are sort of following this generally, but I guess try to avoid the language of catch up and recovery and those sorts of things. You know, if you think about it, when, you know, who are these people catching up to? you know, when they're in the job market, they'll be competing with pupils in the same year or 1 or 2 years above who have all been through a similar thing. I don't think that there really should be any pressure for them to catch up with this kind of concept of where they might have been. And kids are smart, and I think they pick up that language and they hear it on the news, and it creates a bit of anxiety, and it creates a bit of burden and a bit of pressure that probably doesn't need to be there. So that's sort of what we're hearing from a few of our partner schools, and it's definitely something that, yeah, I'd kind of echo for sure.
Thank you. We need to be really cautious of our language. I agree. That's a really good point. Chris, anything from you?
Yeah, just fully endorse what's said there. But I mean, if we focus on, you know, the topic of my talk, assessment, it's about making sure that as schools we're not driven by the panic of how do we assess our students so that we meet some kind of notional criteria at the end of the year, be their exams or be their teacher assessment grades. We need that information, but let's be brave, and as both as governors and teachers, and say, actually, let's collect a rich range of information around what our young people are able to do, both in terms of their knowledge, their skills, their aptitudes, their creative skills. Let's be more open in that, so that we can build in enjoyment into the curriculum, creativity into the curriculum, and we don't fall into the trap that I know some schools fell into. This is anecdotal, but some schools where they were assessing the young people back in school every day, almost all day, in order to create a body of evidence to meet some potential moderation for examination or teacher assessment grade. Let's be braver, let's be wider, let's be more balanced in what we look at to assess the children, the young people holistically.
Lovely, thank you very much. Great takeaway points, I think, from everybody there. We are literally coming to the end now. We heard lots of really useful information. Is there any last point that you would like to make, maybe for governors who are listening, ahead of our campaign that we're running now? I'll just come to each of you in turn if there's any last points. So shall I start with you, Joe?
Yeah, just a thank you for all that you do, I guess. Good, high quality, governorship has probably never been more important for schools than it is right now. I don't think you need to kind of have sort of advice or tips from me, but just, yeah, I think a lot of the teachers that I'm speaking to, they're really relying on their governors at the moment, and yeah, they're really depending on all of you, and the support that governors are able to provide is really helping. So just, yeah, a massive thank you, and yeah, keep up the great work.
Thanks, Joe. Of course, we wholeheartedly agree. They're doing a wonderful job. Tony, over to you.
Yeah, I'm a great believer in the education multiplier. It's that thing that education, knowledge, skills, and governors have loads of that. You can give it away and you never lose it. If I give you my car, I can't drive anywhere. If I give you my home, I've got nowhere to live. But if I give you my knowledge and my experience, and if you give me yours, it multiplies. And I think great governing bodies demonstrate that knowledge multiplier, that education multiplier every time they meet. So it's really valuable. We'll value everything we give you. Education is the best giveaway in the world. It is free. So let's share it. Let's share what we know, and let's work together to build an education system that was better than before. And that's not being critical of what was before, but let's use this system, Joel, to really have a think about what we need to do.
Thank you. Chris, last word from you. I know you.
Yeah, very, very quickly then, it's a really important job as governors. Listen, learn, be curious, but if you do nothing else, ask questions. That's the most powerful thing you can do to drive change in schools. Ask questions, be prepared to ask questions.
Thank you ever so much. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. I'd like to thank our fabulous panel for the benefit of their time and insight, as well as all of you for attending, not just today, but for the whole week. We hope it's been as interesting and enjoyable for you as it has been for us. Please do continue to support All Pupils Every Ambition campaign as we continue to release resources and webinars over the coming months. We will be sharing some of those via email over the next couple of days, so watch out for that. But thanks again, thanks for coming, and have a wonderful evening and weekend. Goodbye.
Right. Thank you.